Out. Today we are going to talk about types of intros because there are multiple types of intro you can pull from on the AP test or even on essays in general. And a lot of you guys are definitely sticking with just one intro over and over again, um, which actually it's fine if you use the same intro every time. That's not going to lower your AP score, but here's my concern with it. My concern with it is if you only have one type of intro to pull from, what happens if you're looking at a prompt and that intro just doesn't seem to fit? The more tools you have in the toolkit, the easier it is for you to construct the house you want. Got it? Okay, so the one that we are very used to using is the philosophical background. What is the philosophical background of it? What should I start by doing? Okay, you should cite a philosopher. You should explain their core beliefs. You should relate that to your topic. That is going to be your transition or your bridge where you explain, okay, you've explained to me what Plato thinks about the cave. Now, what does that have to do with what you're going to write about? And then what should you end with? And then your thesis. So I might have something like Mencius, the ancient Chinese philosopher who followed the beliefs of Confucius, argued that humanity is, by its nature, benevolent. He makes a powerful argument that if an individual sees a child in need, sees a child crying, the immediate response is to comfort the child. And he believes that that immediate response best describes the true human nature, that people are good. However, in this argument by whoever you're reading an argument by, he argues that goodness is a trait that has to be taught. This author is suggesting that goodness is not inherent. This author's arguments fail because of blah and blah, whatever. But you can see how I set that up. I cite the philosopher, I explain the core beliefs, I relate that to the topic, I transition, and then I give the thesis. Y'all are very, very good on this, yes? What is the advantage of this in terms of context or focus? Yeah, this is very powerful in terms of context because what it does is it places that idea into a larger idea. It gives it in. It, instead of having your thesis kind of floating, why is this important, it relates it to something bigger, and that also helps with your exigence. What is exigence? The importance of it. Why should we read about it? Well, when you use a philosophical background intro, why should we read about your paper? Why do we read philosophers? Yeah, it creates exigence because philosophers are talking about what is important in the world. So it places student paper on that important scale. It's kind of like saying, hey, Mencius was saying something important. I'm going to relate what I'm saying to Mencius. So A equals B. If A is important, therefore B is important because I've just said A equals B. And so it gives it that sense of weight. It gives it that sense of exigence. We good? Okay. Can we use this on rhetorical analysis? Yes, we can. But it can pull the topic away from the words of the text. Because on rhetorical analysis, what is it that we're supposed to be focusing on? The rhetoric of what we're reading about. So if we are reading a piece of analysis from Jefferson Davis, and all of a sudden we start talking about Plato, that can feel like pulling away from the topic that we're supposed to be focusing on, which is Jefferson Davis. Can we use philosophical background on an argument paper? Yes. In fact, it works great. So an argument paper is a great place to put this, especially because that argument paper where you got to kind of pull evidence out your butt, you're just pulling it off the top of your head. Being able to pull philosophy off the top of your head really does establish it establishes your ethos. By being able to pull out Descartes or Mencius or even Plato, which apparently every single one of you can pull out Plato often. By being able to pull out these great thinkers, not only are you introducing it in an interesting way, but you're also saying to the reader, dang, I got skills. I can talk to you about Mencius. Okay. So it can provide great focus, but it can also really help establish your ethos. Okay. Does it work in the DBQ synthesis? The DBQ synthesis is the argument paper where you have 6 to 8 sources to pull from. Your evidence must come from the sources. So, does it work for the DBQ synthesis? Yes. But something from the sources might work just as well or better. So, philosophical background, argument, and DBQ, I would say yes. Rhetorical analysis, I would say dangerous. Okay, we ready to move on? Okay. Nope. No, I didn't want you to grab. I wanted you to highlight. Thank you. Okay, let's now talk about historical background. What is the format of a historical background intro? Yep, so you have to identify a specific historical context. Relate it to the topic, which is going to be your bridge. And then what are you going to do? Thesis. The more specific it is, the more powerful it is. It's also great if you can pull something that not everyone knows. If you are pulling a piece of history that, if you're pulling 9/11 as your historical context, it might be accurate. However, is anyone going to be particularly impressed that you know what 9/11 is? No. So if you really want to kickstart that ethos piece where you're telling the reader, dang, I got me skills, you want to pull some history that's a little less well known. By the way, historical, you guys sometimes think that means like pre 1800s. You can talk about something from the 1970s. You can talk about something from the 1990s. That all works, okay? You can even pull current events because do you know what current events are going to be in 10 years? Yeah, yeah. So don't shy away from stuff that's more modern. I had you guys, when you did research, I asked you guys to look at lesser known people so that you could in fact do a historical context intro if you wanted to. So a historical background intro would look something like in the 1800s when Abraham Lincoln was getting ready to become president of the United States, women had almost no rights. They couldn't own property, they couldn't vote, they couldn't open a bank account, and yet one woman by the name of Kate Warren was not going to let her gender define her. She walked into the Pinkerton Detective Agency and told the head of the agency if he didn't hire her that he was a fool because men were idiots around pretty women. And as it turned out, she was right. Kate Warren is the one who identified an assassination plot to take out President Lincoln before he could reach Washington. Kate Warren was on the protection detail that accompanied Lincoln when he was on the new train schedule. Kate Warren proved that women do not have to be defined by the culture they are in. And that's very much what the current author is discussing. The author, whoever you're looking at, is focusing on how women have to challenge their own societies, just like Kate Warren did. She does this by blank and blank. So you're providing that background and you're providing that relationship to what's going on in the current. Now, how does that help you with context or focus? Okay, gives it real world relevance. But you have to make sure it is relevant. If you are pulling historical current event issues that are just interesting, but not necessarily tightly tied to your topic, it can feel like you're changing the topic instead of giving an intro. God bless. I wrote too much. There we go. Okay, how does that relate? How does it work in terms of exigence? It depends. If the hook is a significant historical movement, it makes the topic as important as that point in history. But what is the danger? Yeah, if the historical moment you pull is sort of irrelevant, it can end up just feeling very flat. I'm going to change this yes to a maybe. Using a philosopher on rhetorical analysis. Maybe. Okay, we ready? Okay. Rhetorical analysis. Should we be using a historical hook intro on a rhetorical analysis paper? Take a look at what's above. Maybe. Why? Yeah, it can do the same thing as that philosopher because when you're doing philosophical background, it really is a modified historical context. Um, so it has that same danger that you could end up pulling away from the point of a rhetorical analysis, which is to analyze the actual words that are there. Yes. 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 You absolutely can. You can use the historical context they give you as part of your hook. That's why they give it to you. Now, are you going to score as well in sophistication as somebody who can pull an original intro? No. So it may damage your opportunity to get a sophistication point. But if you're struggling with an intro, 100% go for it. Because it's better to get your thesis point and to get your good argument points than it is to give up those, 4 argument points because you're trying to be sophisticated. So, historical background, though, that can be a little dangerous with rhetorical analysis just because it can feel like you're pulling away. Can you use historical background in an argument? Yes. Yeah, this is a great one for an argument. Just make sure that you are pulling history that is actually like historically significant. Can you use historical background on the DBQ? Okay, look at the thing above. Yeah. So you absolutely can use a historical background with the DBQ, but it may be a little bit touch and go in terms of whether you're pulling away from the information they've given you or whether you're leaning into the information they've given you. Make sense? Okay, 30 seconds with your shoulder partner. Something new you've learned so far today. Go. I didn't get that. Could you try again? Oh, Siri, I'm not talking to you. Okay. Next one. Internal quote. Oh, question. Yes. On the DBQ, if you have a really good historical context that relates, and you're like, yeah, this is the perfect way to draw the reader in, go for it. Okay. But again, do make sure you're not pulling away from what they've given you. Yeah. So, internal quote. An internal quote is where you pull the perfect quote from inside the text you've been given. So, they give you a reading from Martin Luther King Jr., and you're like, man, this one line sums up everything. And you pull it out. So, an internal quote you're going to cite and give the formal quote. And so this is very much what you did freshman year when you did something like John Smith once said, comma, quote. But instead of pulling from a quote book or instead of researching quotes, you know how when you were freshmen, I said, go out on the internet. And if your topic is truth, then search truth and quotes and find a good quote. Do you remember that whole instruction? Okay. Instead of doing that, this is when you're reading and you're going, dang, that right there, that captures everything. And so you start with the quote from inside the reading, and then you set it up just like you would a quote intro. So you cite, you give the formal quote, you explain the quote, you then relate the specific quote to the larger issue, which is going to be your transition, your bridge. And then what are you going to do? Thesis. Karl Marx once stated, the weapon of criticism can never replace criticism of the weapon. What he was saying is that even as we try and change the world, we must be critical of those who use violence to enable that change. He did not believe in violence. Of course, this is greatly ironic given that later his philosophies were used to engender entire wars. However, in this piece, it is clear through Karl Marx's use of complex sentence structure and his metaphors that he is against violence. Okay? So I find a quote that captures everything, and then I set it up like a freshman quote intro. It's not a freshman quote intro, it's just a dang good intro. Now, you don't have access to internet, you don't have access to quote books. But if you find the perfect quote while you are reading, this can be a great way to start an introduction. Okay? I love that quote by Karl Marx, by the way, because it is so dang ironic. Oh, sweetie, you didn't believe in violence. Oh, yeah. Okay, we good? Okay. Now, how does that help you with context? Focus. Yeah, it is going to focus on a very specific text. But a good quote will also focus on a big idea. Violence, truth, human nature, faith, death. A good quote is going to have some really big idea in there that it also focuses on. Are y'all getting some good notes? Because y'all know what I'm going to ask you to do next. Uh-huh. Well, I want you guys to be flexible with your intros. I want you to have different ways that you can write an intro. Kaden, you awake? Okay. Okay. My next question is exigence. How does a quote intro work in terms of exigence? Oh, no. Undo. There we go. Your intro is going to feel. Wait a minute. It's only going to feel as important as. Yes. So the exigence here is all relying on how important is the author or how important is the quote. So if you pull a really weak quote, your whole intro will feel really weak. If you pull a really strong quote, your whole intro will feel super strong. You are leaning entirely on the exigence of that single quote, which can be great or horrible. Okay. Internal quote. How effective is this for a rhetorical analysis? Yes. Because if you're doing rhetorical analysis and so you're reading that piece by Jefferson Davis, if you pull, if there is like the perfect quote in the middle of that you're like, yes, that captures his idea, that can provide a really great opening quote. A great quote. I can type. Yes, I can. It's Monday. Because when you're doing rhetorical analysis, you're supposed to be focusing on the words of that author. So using an internal quote focuses you entirely on the words of the author. So if you can find a good quote in there, this is a great way to start. How about on argument? Internal quote on argument. Do you have any text to pull from in an argument? No. This is a pull it out your butt essay. And so you have no quotes to pull from. And I've had kids do this weird thing where they're like, I'm going to memorize really great quotes. Okay, dude, good for you. However, when you're in the middle of high stakes testing and you know that getting college credit is on the line, how stressed out are you? What happens to your memory when you're stressed? You forget stuff. So, yeah, I've had kids that like memorize quotes. They're like, I've got 10 quotes that I've memorized. I'm going to be able to pull one for the essay. And then they come back after the testing and they're like, I couldn't remember any of my quotes. This is not shocking. You have other intro types. So, guess what you're not going to use on an argument? An internal quote intro. Just like, no, just don't do it. How about on the DBQ? Okay, it might work as long as it doesn't sound like you're favoring what? One, yeah, one source over the others. The danger here is that if you pull a quote from source B in your opening hook and then rely a lot on B in your paper itself, it starts to sound like you're just a cheerleader for source B instead of being an objective evaluator of all of the sources. Make sense? So you absolutely can use an internal quote on a DBQ. Just make sure that you are not overly privileging one of the sources over others. Sort of a complex tap dance to decide what's going to work best. Okay, now, special sort of internal quote, where instead of pulling something because it's these wise words, criticism of the weapon the weapon of criticism can never replace criticism of the weapon. Beautiful quote. I always have to stop and think about it for a second, though. Instead of pulling an internal quote because of the beauty of it, instead you pull an internal quote because it contains some sort of number or some sort of statement. It's not always a statistic, but you pull something that startles you. So maybe you are reading something and you run into the statistic that 70% of suicide victims are white males. Would that shock you guys? I mean, there's the whole stereotype that girls are more dramatic, and yet mostly the people killing themselves are white men. So you can pull a startling statistic and put it up front, and that becomes your hook. In school, there's a lot of discussion about preventing suicide. However, very few people bring up the statistic used in source C that reveals that 70% of suicide victims are in fact white men. This highlights a very significant danger in the way we treat suicide. People tell others not to commit suicide. However, they are unwilling to discuss the truths about suicide, whether those be statistics or causes or even ways to actively prevent it. Instead, the focus tends to be on just don't do it. The sources illustrate the importance of not only sharing accurate information, but providing students multiple choices in how to address the issue of suicide. Do you now see my two body paragraphs? So you start off with something that startles the audience. Oh, where'd my startle the audience? Then explain the context of that startle. Relate it to your topic. That's your bridge. And then, of course, what do you always end with? Thesis. Oops, sorry. Good Lord. I'm having issues. I apologize. I'm very issuey this morning. Okay. How does that work in terms of context or focus? Okay. It focuses a lot of attention on one idea. If the idea that you pull to startle people with, if that's an appropriate issue to focus on, you've got great context. If you startle people with something that is irrelevant or is not directly related to your topic, you are in trouble. Okay, what about the exigence? Yep. And that is the hook will feel as important as, we don't have a quote, so the hook will feel as important as the information. So, if the idea that 70% of suicide victims are white males, I should look up how many are just males. But if you're not startled by that, if that doesn't feel important to you, then my whole intro is going to fall. It's going to fall flat. So you are relying on that startling statement, that startling statistic. You are relying on that to feel important to the reader. How does that work for rhetorical analysis? Yeah, probably no. Probably no. Because you're trying to talk to the reader about why the word usage in this particular article is significant. So trying to startle them with something feels very, yeah, it's like, why are you doing that? That you're supposed to be talking to me about how impressive this writing is, not startling me with the writing. That, yeah, that's probably going to be a no. How about with an argument? Good if you have something. So when you're doing that off the top of your head essay, it can be hard to have a startling statistic or startling statement just in your back pocket. So that's why you've got to have a variety of different tools. How about with DBQ? Yes. If you find something startling and relevant, this could 100% be great. Okay. Now, are all these intros types of intros you've done in the past? Well, you've been taught all of them in the past. Yes? Because I know I have taught internal quote and startling statistic. I assume that you've done historical background in either sophomore year or in history class. Okay, I'm seeing nods. And I taught you philosophical background. So you've learned all of these things. But the problem is you've got to learn how to pick and choose when they are appropriate. And that means that you've got to have a little bit of flexibility about which type of intro you can pull in any given assignment. Now, when I say yes and no over here, realize these are my suggestions. However, the tools that you choose, that has to be up to you. You have to be choosing what you're comfortable with, what you think fits the topic, what you think is going to be effective for what you're trying to get across. Because you have to have your voices come through, not follow a formula I've given you. Make sense? Okay.